These are Americans. More than 190 million of them. A people whose story is one of movement and change. A record of migration that is unique in history. Men and women of many races and creeds, Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. Immigrants were entering the country at the rate of 1 million a year. Of these latecomers, many lacked the means to make their way beyond the ports of arrival. Crowded in the cities of the coast, suspended between the past and the future, bewildered, they found it difficult to accept the shifting forms they were expected to follow.
Jews and Catholics both arrived on the scene at around the same time, largely as a result of the huge amount of migration that took place over the last part of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century. They both arrived at the time when the Protestant ruling class had simply lost its nerve. It had lost its ability to determine culture. You can see something like an artifact like The Great Gatsby as an example of this. Tom Buchanan is talking about, you know, those people are taken over. You got to read Stoddard's book about race and this type of stuff. And you have the Gatsby, the Jew, and the narrator, or Fitzgerald himself as the Catholic, both looking to the WASP as the kind of paradigm to emulate at a time when the WASP itself is not really sure of this anymore. A lot of what I'm saying here is taken from a book recently published, Andrew R. Heinze, Jews and the American Soul, Human Nature in the 20th Century, Princeton University Press, 2004. Heinze says in his book that psychology provided a perfect focal point for a culture clash between Jews and Catholics as they moved from the periphery toward the center of a society traditionally dominated by Protestants. For many Jews, psychology and Freud represented a path toward a more sophisticated, cosmopolitan America. For many Catholics, Freud signified a heretical departure from fundamental religious values. Now, in his book, the culmination of this conflict comes with Archbishop Sheen and Clare Boothe Luce after World War II. Archbishop Sheen was a huge presence in 1950s America. He had a show, a television show, where he went toe-to-toe with Milton Berle and beat him in the ratings all the time. He was having a huge effect on the culture. Large numbers of Americans were converting to Catholicism at this point. It was a huge cultural battle, and by the 50s, the mid-50s, it focused on Sigmund Freud. Sheen gave a sermon at St. Patrick's at which he talked about Freud and the confessional, and basically talked about psychoanalysis as a secularized version of the confessional. It caused a huge stir. There was an article in the American Scholar which accused both Fulton Sheen and Clare Boothe Luce of being anti-Semites because they don't like Sigmund Freud. Now this is a state-of-the-art battle here that's going on here. What we're talking about here is a takeover, a redefinition, just as Fish and Derrida decades later would engage in a redefinition of discourse. The Jews at this point were engaging largely through the use of Sigmund Freud in a redefinition of the soul. Now, I mean this in a perfectly literal sense. We're talking about psyche, the Greek word for soul, and so therefore we're talking about psychology, which is the science of the soul. Now, this is classic psychology. Okay, this is Greek. And in Greek, it goes all the way back to people like Euripides and Plato. The classic definition of the soul, or the image of the soul, was the rider on a horse. The rider was reason, the horse was passion, and in many ways the bridle was the will. And so you had the tripartite soul: reason, will, passion. Logos, ethos, pathos. And that was the right rule. Reason ruled passion the way the rider rode a horse. What happened over the course of the 20th century is that was inverted. In other words, we had a revolution in psychology that paralleled the later revolution in hermeneutical thought. What you had to do was, in effect, redefine the soul so that it lost all of its, what should I say, Christian characteristics, even though it's only Christian in the minds of the Jews that wanted to subvert it. This is not Christian. This is not a Christian soul. It's the Greek soul. It was adopted by Aquinas and by the Catholic Church, but it's basically a Greek idea. This is what Heinze says about this period of time. G. Stanley Hall had a classic work, and it was known as Adolescence, published in 1904. According to Heinze, Hall's work was, quote, saturated in Christian reference. At this point, what happened was a war like the literary critical wars, but this became a psychological, a war over who was going to determine what the soul was. The leader in this war at this particular time was an anthropologist by the name of Franz Boas, a Jew, whose assistant was going to be sort of the leading soldier, the sort of the frontal assault on Hall's book, and her name was Margaret Mead.
Franz Boas was an intellectual of Jewish extraction. He came from Germany. He became very important in the early 20th century, and the reason he was important was because he was the father of a school of anthropology that essentially said that race was not important in explaining any differences between any groups of people. His descendants have been people who have pathologized any reference, any concept of race, racial differences, and so on. This is sort of a pillar of the intellectual left in the 20th century. And he's important because he founded this school. They became the heads of the departments of very important universities, so that by the mid-1920s, his students basically dominated the American Anthropological Association. They had a very clear ethnic political agenda, at least for the Jews among them. In other words, Franz Boas was not just a sort of intellectual pursuing truth or something like that. He well recognized that he had a very strong Jewish identity. That one of his main goals in life, one of his main purposes was to promote this intellectual perspective, which he thought would be important for combating anti-Semitism. He had the sort of rise of racial anti-Semitism culminating in the National Socialist movement in Germany. He viewed his ideology as combating that. He was also associated with far-left political organizations, and that's been typical, I think, of his disciples as you go down. He died in the late 1930s, but then his disciples effectively dominated anthropology down to the present.
It's classically portrayed as the nature versus nurture battle. In other words, the issue was environment or race at this point, and Boas and these people had decided that the important thing was environment, and they had to defeat the racist.
One of his big ideas was that you couldn't make generalizations about culture. You couldn't develop a theory, a universal theory of culture, because each culture was, incredibly unique, sort of beyond the pale of scientific generalizations. And prior to him, there was a sort of robust evolutionary theory of culture where you had these various grades of culture, beginning with hunter-gatherers, chiefdoms, nation-state societies, and so on. And the problem he had with that was that the people who were doing this viewed European culture as a pinnacle. And that to him was anathema. He was a strongly identified Jew. He viewed the Prussian culture of his childhood as very dangerous. He had very negative memories of that, very negative attitudes about that culture. And I think that's sort of the common denominator, I think, of all these Jewish intellectual movements that we'll talk about. is this underlying, hostility, distrust, this deep historical memory of the negative things that have happened to Jews in European culture. So when he thinks of the Prussian culture of Germany, he doesn't think of cathedrals and kings and leaders. He thinks of that there were elements of anti-Semitism there, that it was a Christian culture, that Christians have oppressed Jews over the centuries. So for him, these cultures were not the pinnacle of civilization. They weren't the pinnacle of science or anything. And so as an attempt to deconstruct culture, this is the origin of the sort of cultural relativist movement, that all cultures are sort of equal. There's no way to grade them in terms of even of their technical accomplishments or anything. He had famous disciples, Margaret Mead.
She was the person who, under Boas's direction, went to Samoa, did a study of the natives in Samoa, and came back and said that basically Sturm und Drang, storm and stress, they got it from Schiller, but since psychology was German, they were using terms like this. Sturm und Drang during adolescence is only a cultural phenomenon. It's only in America. It's all the result of Christianity. If we eliminate all of these Christian sexual prohibitions, there will be no stress in society. And as proof of that, look at the people in Samoa. Well, the fact of the matter is that it became apparent after the publication of Derek Freeman's book, Margaret Mead in Samoa, an Australian anthropologist. It became apparent that Margaret Mead made it all up. It was one of the biggest instances of academic fraud in the 20th century. She didn't speak Samoan. Freeman says she was just put on by Samoan girls who would giggle and tell jokes and make fun of the round eye or whatever they call these white people in Samoa. And she overlooked a significant part of Samoan culture, which was basically digital rape, was part of Samoan culture. Didn't get mentioned at all. There were also, if the Samoan man sits under a palm tree with his, the guy's sister, the guy beats up the guy. You can't do that with my sister. And so on and so forth. In other words, it was made up. It was what we would call Blue Lagoon anthropology, based on, the Blue Lagoon movie with Brooke Shields. It's basically, it's like the plot of Lord of the Flies. The plane is flying. It crashes on this tropical island in the Pacific, and suddenly, hey, all bets are off. Because all of that stuff you believe was the moral law, that's all bourgeois morality. There's no bourgeoisie here. So morality doesn't have any force anymore, and we can all live like, free and wonderful people. The French had this fantasy. Rousseau was probably the main proponent of it with his idea of the noble savage. And now it caught on in America as a way of undermining the whole idea that there was a Christian morality that should be normative for this country.
So it was a mythology, but it was a very effective mythology. Margaret Mead essentially created a mythical anthropology that was accepted as gospel. Again, her writings aren't very important except for the fact that they were promoted and became intellectual gospel, to the point that even after she was debunked and was shown to be a myth, shown to be false, shown to be either lies or misinformation, that she is still ionized, and people were horrified that her reputation would be called into question. So it's a very powerful thing that anybody who disagrees with all this is up against. It's got a huge inertia at this point. It's very hard to change. These things take on a life of their own. It's a matter of promotion. It's not a matter of truth or reality. It's a matter of leading a movement that has an influence. And so the influence comes not so much from the original person, but from the infrastructure, the publishing houses, the media, the professors in universities who assign Margaret Mead as part of their courses. This is where it achieves a life of its own, and it is seen as true, it is seen as science, it is seen as inviolably correct. And I think the concept of race is very respectable. But still, the concept of race is profoundly controversial. So this is the legacy of that, and we still see that in the present, because people like Philippe Rushton at the University of Western Ontario in Canada, Richard Lynn, their analyses of racial differences in intelligence in different peoples of the world is the exact sort of thing that is anathema to the Boasian school, and that continues with us today, because the writings of people like Rushdie and Lynn are marginalized. They're not talked about. If they're ever mentioned in the newspapers, they tend to be qualified. You'll bring in all these other people who say that's nonsense. You can't even give the concept of intelligence doesn't make any sense. There is no such thing as race, etc. So it remains problematic to this day. The transformation of the universities in the United States in the direction of political correctness, a lot of that has to be laid at the foot of Franz Boas. Sigmund Freud is the most famous psychologist of the 20th century. Like Franz Boas, he started a school of psychology. Like Franz Boas, he viewed anti-Semitism as an enormous problem. He himself was subjected to anti-Semitism when he was young, as was Franz Boas. And this stayed with him. This was an important part of their psyche, and you can see this in their writings, that they viewed the eradication of anti-Semitism as a very important criterion for a good theory, basically. So at a deep level, psychoanalysis was about developing a theory that could be used to oppose anti-Semitism. Freud consciously viewed himself as someone who was combating Western culture. He viewed himself as a sort of Semitic general fighting Rome. There's some very striking passages in his letters. He identified with Hannibal, who was a Semitic general fighting against Rome. In Jewish thought, Rome is often viewed as the quintessential West. And when they think of Rome, they think of Rome destroying the Second Temple, that Rome fundamentally as this sort of evil Western power. And Freud viewed himself as psychoanalysis was a mechanism of cultural warfare, as it were. Psychoanalysis was sort of flagrantly unscientific. I mean, they didn't even make the pretense of doing a good study of anything. At the time, in the early 20th century, the dominant school in psychology in America and England was behaviorism. And behaviorism, even though I'm not a behaviorist at all, what you have to say about the behaviorists is that they had a strong sense that psychology had to be based on experimentation. You had to have control groups. You had to have well-validated observations and instruments. This was completely foreign to psychoanalysis. So, psychoanalysis, even though it made a huge impact on the culture, even though it dominated departments of psychiatry, it did not dominate departments of psychology to anywhere near that extent. And that's because departments of psychology in America and England had the strong empirical sense. And so they criticized psychoanalysis. They went, where's your data? Show me some studies. Even some of Freud's followers, very early on, became disillusioned with it. They didn't see the data. They started to realize that psychoanalysis is basically a set of propositions that are being promulgated by leaders. And if you were a follower, you would simply accept these. If you did not accept them, you were simply written out of the movement. So it was not conducted as a normal science. And that produced skepticism among behaviorists and other American psychologists. So that it never got that extent of domination in psychology. Where it really was important and really dominated was in the area of psychiatry. Psychiatry became dominated by the Freudians, but that has disappeared because of the rise of biological psychiatry. I mean, nowadays, when psychiatrists think of depression, they're much more likely to think about what drugs you can use, what parts of the brain are involved in depression. Of course, we didn't have that back in the early 20th century. And so psychoanalysts could say anything they wanted about depression or neurosis. They could make up stories about repressing sex or whatever story they wanted. And that was pretty much accepted. And then you'd bring patients who had neuroses in and you'd talk to them. And hopefully they got better. Maybe they didn't. Mostly they didn't.
A kind of quack from Berlin invited Freud to come to Berlin and visit with him. And Freud wrote back and said, I'd like to come, but I'm afraid my patients will get well in my absence. This gives you some indication of the predatory attitude that Freud had toward his patients. He had a cartoon that he used to keep in his office, a lion, and under the lion it says, Schon 12 Uhr Mittag und keiner Neger. It's already noon and no Negroes. In other words, I'm hungry, I need a Negro to come in here, I need to eat the Negro. Well, what's the Negro? Well, that's the patient. And so the best example would be Horace Frink, this doctor from America. He wants to be a psychoanalyst, so he shows up with Freud, and during the course of his psychoanalysis with Freud, he says, I have this sexual attraction toward my patients. Isn't this bad? I mean, isn't it bad if you screw one of your patients? Isn't that unethical? Not to say even beyond the fact that you're married to someone else. Well, what does Freud say? Well, no, he didn't think it was a bad idea. As a matter of fact, he urged Frink to dump his wife and marry this woman because she had a lot of money, and then give a significant contribution to the Psychoanalytic Society. I mean, this is outrageous. This is an outrageous conflict of interest, an outrageous abuse of the whole idea of medicine, and certainly an abuse of what psychiatry is. And Freud himself was involved in it. This isn't an abuse. This is the heart of the matter, because psychoanalysis is a form of sexual liberation as political control.
I think the genius of Freud was to develop a sort of metaphor or sort of paradigm that people resonated to automatically. Because, you know, obviously the repression of sexuality sort of was an important part of Western culture. If I was just struck watching the movie Kinsey, which is about Kinsey, the sexual reformer. He was not really a Freudian, but you could see that repression of sexuality that was so typical a part of the culture in which he grew up in, where you were concerned about if masturbation was a sin. And I remember growing up in the 1950s in a religious environment, feeling guilty about any kind of impure thoughts about women's sexuality, much less doing things. So that was part of our culture, and I think people, obviously, some people it did not fit well with them. They saw that as inhibiting their natural desires and so on. So it became a sort of rallying point, I think, for the intellectual left. People like Kinsey were certainly greeted by psychoanalysts, and you could see him having problems with his religious environment. His father was a preacher. His father viewed, sex as evil, and essentially, and that was part of the zeitgeist at the time. So when Freud, talked about sex as the fundamental basis of all things neurotic, it had a certain surface plausibility. It wasn't ridiculous, I suppose. It wasn't based on science, but it was based, I think, on a sort of attractive paradigm.
Sigmund Freud became the learned Jew when it came to the doctor. In other words, you got a problem, go to the doctor. The doctor has science, the scientist will cure you. Well, that was sort of the myth that got promoted about Sigmund Freud after the fact, around the same time that the Margaret Mead fraud is coming to light. It turns out that that's not exactly what Sigmund Freud was doing.
One of the things I've noticed with Jewish intellectual movements is they tend to be centered around a sort of charismatic leader. Certainly Boas was that way. Freud was that way to the max. I mean, he was the quintessential guru with devoted disciples who were centered around him. They developed the associations of psychoanalysis were very highly organized, top-down societies. People who dissented from these doctrines were excluded. So it was not really scientific in the normal sense. We think of science as open to new ideas, that you could have a study that would disprove something like the Oedipal complex or something like that. That would be perfectly normal in a real science. In psychoanalysis, anybody who disagreed with the Oedipal complex was simply expelled. And usually they would be expelled with saying they had psychopathology. So it was not conducted as a normal science. There were a sort of central organization. People who dissented were expelled. People who were on board were admitted, and but there was a sort of pecking order. If you were close to Sigmund Freud, if you had personal relationship with him, if you had been psychoanalyzed by Freud, that meant you were very close to the top. And so leadership in the society depended pretty much on how closely you were associated with Freud. which of course is very much unlike a real science. A real science, the personalities of the scientists are really not important. It's what they have done. Their ideas are open to refutation. You can change them. You can bring new data. That's the normal practice of science. Psychoanalysis never operated that way. There were a set of core doctrines. It was like a religion, literally like a religion, or like a sort of political view like communism or something like that, where you had to accept certain things. And if you didn't, well, you just weren't part of the group anymore.
It's portrayed as medicine because of the influence that the people who want to promote this have over modern culture. Okay, and so you have all sorts of people now disciples of the new psychology. One of them is a man by the name of Jastrow, who ends up at the University of Wisconsin. This is Heinz's description of what Jastrow was doing at the University of Wisconsin. Jastrow targeted Christianity in a way that Pierce did not, as the prime example of the forcible imposition of thought on a community of people. In his course at Wisconsin on the psychology of belief and in his popular writings, he spoke of, quote, the sad page of history that records the church's techniques of censorship and suppression of thought. He also used the biblical and rabbinical phraseology of the remnant of Israel when he referred to the dissident few who fight in all times and places for freedom of thought. There will always be a saving remnant, he wrote, who are willing to give up dogma. Well, wait a minute. I thought you were in medicine. I thought you were doing medicine here. Well, what you're seeing here is that deviance has been redefined. It will be redefined over the course of the century, and what used to be a sin is now a virtue. For example, homosexuality. What used to be an aberration is now normal, and what used to be normal, namely, let's say, the revulsion at homosexuality, is now a thought crime under the regime of political correctness. So a student at Temple University, my alma mater, who objects to the production of Corpus Christi by the university, was dragged out and taken to the psychiatric clinic at Temple University Hospital for objecting to a blasphemous homosexual propaganda play. Well, this is the essence of political correctness, and it's the essence of what happened during the course of the 20th century. Deviance was redefined as its opposite. Deviance is binary. Deviance is prohibition. There is never going to be a world without deviance. What you have here is the Umwertung aller Werte, the transvaluation of values where what was good is now bad and what was good is now wicked. This happened in the realm of psychology, largely through the efforts of people like Freud. So you see this as a way of cultural subversion. Freud became the vehicle for cultural subversion and was interested in those particular terms.
The Frankfort School started in the 1920s in Germany. It was composed entirely of a group of Jewish intellectuals associated with the University of Frankfurt in Germany. They were certainly part of the intellectual left, and seen that way in Germany. When Hitler came to power, he dissolved them. They came to the United States, most of them, and they pursued their studies in the United States. Now, when they came to the United States, they were confronted with a sort of empirical culture that was not so typical of Germany. Germany was more still in this sort of philosophical era. The intellectual life would have been dominated by people like Marx and Hegel and that sort of philosophical idealism or materialism in the case of Marx. And those were where the debates were. Because the English tradition, you can see in American sociology, was much more empirical. You go out and you get numbers. So when they came to America, they really had a need to develop an empirical study. And so they became much more empirically oriented. And so, but their philosophical ideas were developed when they were still in Germany. They were very much informed by their political attitudes. And these people, as I say, they were all Jews. They were deeply identified, strongly identified Jews. And once again, they were fundamentally concerned with anti-Semitism as a problem. And so they viewed their philosophy, and it really was a philosophy before it became an empirical study. It was a philosophy of anti-Semitism. And in that philosophy, they really used fundamental psychoanalytic concepts. So they had the idea that anti-Semitism fundamentally comes from repressing nature. I mean, that's about as psychoanalytic as you can get. By repressing nature, you develop hatred to the Jews. And they even used ideas like projection, which is very much of a psychoanalytic idea. In other words, the idea would be that a non-Jew would have a problem, say, in his economic livelihood or something like that, or he would want power for his own group. Well, he would that is sort of morally questionable, and so he'd repress that and project that onto the Jews. So the Jews would be seen as lusting after power and as oppressing Gentiles, when in fact, according to this theory, it was the Gentiles themselves who wanted power, and it was these wealthy Gentiles who would get these people to think that it was the Jews who were the problem, when really they were oppressing the Jews, and they were also oppressing the poorer classes of non-Jews. So this was a theory. It was not based on any data. Once again, it was based on a sort of combination Marxism and psychoanalysis. No empirical data for this. But when they came to America, they couldn't just sell this as a philosophy, because in America you really had to get some data. Psychoanalysis has managed to get by for decades without this, but I think the Frankfort School felt the need to sort of get some kind of verification. So what they did when they got to this country was they started with the authoritarian personality studies. And again, they got into very elite universities. They're associated with Columbia University, the University of California at Berkeley. And they came up with these questionnaires and so on, essentially designed to tap people's attitudes about Jews and try to show that these were a sign of pathology. So essentially what they did, they tried to show that people, in the end, with healthy family relationships, people who looked up to their mothers and fathers, people who had a strong religious orientation, that these people tended to have negative views about Jews, and that essentially these negative views about Jews were a result of repression within the family, that they had hostility towards their parents, even though there's absolutely no evidence of this in any of the records that they had. They interpreted positive feelings for parents as sort of sublimations of hostility, because in the records, the people who had strong family relationships, had sort of strong attitudes about their in-group or their family, their nation, their race, these people tended to think, to have more negative views about Jews, because after all, Jews were an out-group. They interpreted these positive attitudes about their family as, repressions of hostility towards their parents. And conversely, when they found sort of surface feelings of anxiety about their parents, they interpreted those as signs of deep affection. And so the people that they were idealizing had sort of anxieties about whether their parents loved them. They had ambivalences about their sexual identity and so on. These are the people that the Frankfort School were promulgating as the ideal liberal personality.
The major obstacle was the family. The nuclear family, with the father in the lead role, was extremely dangerous. Frankfurt School saw it as a repressive structure. So the nuclear family, with a certain amount of restraint that's necessary for a family to function, was the place that people learned to be repressed. And they got conditioned to following orders. And this made them into what a later writer, Adorno, would spin into a book called the authoritarian personality. And the authoritarian personality was very bad. It conditioned us for a society where we would follow orders, hence, patriotism. So when the Kaiser called, Germans rallied to the cause. When the President of the United States called, or the Prime Minister of Britain, or the President of France, people, because of the nuclear family, were conditioned to respond to the father figure. Anyway, that all is really pretty simplistic, but that's what they said. So it became very, very important to undermine the family.
When I was a student at Johns Hopkins, I can recall in sociology and political science class, they did nothing but talk about this book published in 1950, The Authoritarian Personality. But they talked about it, they analyzed it, they criticized it, they talked about the methodologies and this and that. We actually it was a subject on my exams. But the weird thing was, they never assigned the book for us to read. And of course, it's only much later, you see, when I was browsing a used bookstore that I discovered the reason why they never assigned the book. Lo and behold, right here on the introductory page, The Authoritarian Personality, copyright 1950 by the American Jewish Committee. This is ethnic politics. This isn't science. This is unbelievable. And so many of the problems now facing white Gentiles, which they may or may not feel yet, arise out of this study and the prejudices, the bigoted positions that are set forth very candidly right in the introduction to the study. Let me read you a short passage which will illustrate the point. The present inquiry into the nature of the potentially fascistic individual began with anti-Semitism in the focus of attention. My, what a surprise, given who's sponsoring the study. The authors, in common with most social scientists, hold the view that anti-Semitism is based largely upon factors in the subject, that is to say, in the anti-Semite, and in his total situation, whatever that means, then upon actual characteristics, behavior, or power of Jews. Now that's really interesting. That is to say, the study of anti-Semitism is isolated in this project to characteristics of individuals they identify as authoritarian personalities. It never examines the relationship between that individual's interests and the practical and enormous exercise of Jewish power, you see, within the political system. It never examines the consequences and impact of Jewish power upon that individual and his reaction to it, you see, because then the whole subject becomes much more nuanced and, frankly, far less prejudiced and far less bigoted. And here's another classic statement in the introduction to the authoritarian personality, where they are discussing the methodology of all the studies in this thick tome. And they say here, groups in which there was a preponderance of minority group members were avoided in the study. And when minority group members happened to belong to an organization which which cooperated in the study, their questionnaires were excluded from the calculations. What they're saying there is that, you see, prejudice and racism are uniquely white characteristics. This isn't science at all. It's simply ethnic warfare, and it is such blatant and obvious ethnic warfare, this book, and everything it spawned.
The authoritarian personality did become very influential, and it certainly does have some data in it. It's not, you know, they were successful, you know, in impressing, I think, a lot of people. But even early on, when it first came out, there were critics who looked at it and said, look, there's some weird stuff going on here. The reality was that they used psychoanalysis as a way of basically getting anything they wanted out of this stuff. So there was some deception going on. I tried to, you know, I took special pains to show how counterintuitive these interpretations are, how lacking in scientific rigor.
They have embarked upon the promotion of a policy that is to deconstruct, or that is to tear down the major foundations of Western society, the loyalty to the nuclear family, loyalty to religion, to God, and loyalty to country. And in pursuit of doing that, they play fast and loose with the facts. For them, it's the thought or the ideology that counts, not the empiric justification for conclusions.
The Frankfort School, at its base, developed the ideology that you had to sort of reject your family. By rejecting your family, you would then be more likely to accept, or you would be less likely to be anti-Jewish. And so, you know, it's a remarkable thing, because they never supposed that Jewish children should reject their parents. If they're going to promulgate Judaism to the next generation, you have to have children who identify with their parents. But in the authoritarian personality, identifying with your parents, who were Christian especially, was the epitome of pathology. This had to be eradicated. What you see with the authoritarian personality is holding out individualism, radical individualism, as a cultural ideal. Now, of course, individualism has long roots in European society. But what you're talking about with radical individualism is giving up all your allegiances. You just become the isolated individual. This is not a prescription that Jews have ever adopted. I mean, if there's anything that is characteristic of Judaism, it's a strong sense of identification with a group. So essentially this is a prescription for the behavior of Gentiles that would essentially make them less likely to have allegiances with other groups. Because from the standpoint of Jews, what is the most terrifying thing is a group of non-Jews united by an ideology where they have a strong sense of group membership and which Jews are viewed negatively. I mean, the paradigm of that would be, of course, National Socialism in Germany from 1933 to 1945. Fundamentally, what Nazism was about was having a strong sense of being a member of a nation, having a strong sense that you're part of an in-group, and these other people are not, you're not on their page, Jews especially. And so one way to get rid of that, basically, is to advocate individualism for everybody. Get rid of your allegiances. Don't have any allegiance to religion, country, race, even family. And again, one of the points I keep making there is that this is completely hypocritical, because to be a strong identified Jew means that you are highly connected to a group, that you have a strong sense of group membership, that you think of outgroups as potentially threatening, as enemies, and so on. In other words, the psychological processes of group membership tend to make us view negatively the people in other groups, and that applies to Jews as well as anybody else. So strongly identified Jews tend to have strongly positive views of their in-group, strongly negative views of the outsiders. And that's part of the culture of critique. These Jewish intellectuals have very negative views about the culture and peoples of the outside them.
One of the questions about the spread of the Frankfort School of ideology in the United States, and especially in universities, is how they jumped so quickly from being a handful of people in key universities to dominating the university system. It was their presence throughout the system. While boasienne anthropology was spread by a careful process of the development of cadres and placing them in key positions over the course of a generation, the Frankfort School very quickly came to ascendancy all across American higher education. And this has always remained kind of a mystery, but I think part of the mystery is explained by the role of the New School for Social Research and its agenda, which was to credential Jewish refugees from Europe before, during, and after World War II. These people were credentialed in a very pro forma manner. Very few of them did anything like what we would consider coursework. They were simply given advanced degrees. They turned out torrents of PhDs, and moreover, this was part of a broader stream of European Jews, many with phony credentials, coming into the United States at the very moment of the largest expansion of the American university system in its history, which was during the GI Bill after World War II. Suddenly there was a need for thousands of new professors. And these could not be conservatives because they were still politically risky after World War II. But Jews were considered to be morally pure because of their terrible suffering, and their credentials were never looked at too closely. Suddenly there were thousands, tens of thousands of new professors, and they all held this ideology, which was an ideology that was based on advancing their own interests.
It was very influential in the academic community, and it spawned a whole lot of secondary literature, you might say. Again, the authoritarian personality was funded by the American Jewish Committee, and there was a whole spate of books funded by the American Jewish Committee or the Anti-Defamation League. The whole point of these books was pretty much the same as the authoritarian personality. The idea is that majorities must tolerate minorities. They should not be concerned about their own eclipse. That if you are any kind of psychological anxiety that a majority might feel, that they are going to become a minority, and what that might mean for a majority is viewed as, just a psychopathology. It's a medical health problem. We have to try to get rid of it. White Americans basically should accept this, and if they don't, then there's something wrong with you.
One place boasienne ideology and the Frankfort School come together is in their agreement that majorities can have no rights. This arises from the notion that there are no true majorities. So, for example, While Jews may form a cohesive, solid, and long-lasting minority group, the ideas of cultural relativism and of the Frankfort School act to disintegrate majorities. So, for example, there is no 65% white majority in the United States. There may be a few percent of Irish, a few percent of German, a few percent of this, a few percent of that. The kinds of differences that are created among the majority disintegrated in both of these ideologies. So while they are immune from these kinds of atomization ideologies and practices, they impose these on the majorities. So it's meaningful to speak of the French people and exclude the French. It's meaningful to speak of the British people while excluding the Scots, Irish, Welsh, and English. We see this at every institutional level. So, for example, in law schools, there are interest groups and student organizations for every imaginable ethnicity, except for the majority. Majority students simply don't exist. Now, a white man can be gay, he can be a transsexual, and then he becomes a minority. He has higher quality as a result of being made into a minority. A white woman can become a feminist, and so she can be a member of a minority. So piece by piece, the majority is simply dismantled. This is the basis of the idea that majorities cannot exist. If a majority exists in the thinking of the Frankfort School and in the thinking of the Boasians, it is simply not dismantled yet. And yet minority groups, by definition, are supposed to be immune from this, although in practice, only one minority is immune from this process of disintegration.
Again, I make the point at one point, that this is never thought about as an ideology, say in Israel, where you have a very clear ideology. This is a Jewish state. It's going to remain a Jewish state. It has a moral right to remain a Jewish state, and so on. But the rights of white Americans to keep America as a white country with a white majority, where white ethnic interests would be safeguarded, is completely rejected in this literature. And I think that is the fundamental premise of political correctness. Basically the idea that white people as a majority have no moral legitimacy to any political power, that they don't have any moral authority to maintain a majority, to advance their ethnic interests, to think of a certain piece of land as their land, essentially, that they would be able to control that, and so on. Again, this is an ideology that you see throughout history, that all peoples have, they've basically gotten a hunk of land and they've defended it. This has been the major, story, obviously, in human history, and it's certainly the case with Zionists in Israel. So it's a normal human undertaking. And yet, with this literature, the whole thrust of it is to call that into question, to say that there is no moral legitimacy, that white Americans should simply accept their coming minority status, and anything else is there's something wrong if you think otherwise. There's something wrong with you. And of course, the implicit idea here is that white people have nothing to fear about a future in which they are a minority, that their political interests, their ethnic interests are met by allowing tens of millions of people to come into the land, that they're going to vote, they're going to have their own ideas about what is a proper foreign policy, they're going to have allegiances to the people that they left behind, as Jewish Americans certainly have allegiances to Israel. So it's a very frightening thing. I think that one of the things about the Frankfort School is it was always presented as fundamentally a moral issue and a psychiatric issue. And fundamentally, it's about white guilt. I think the big story of the 20th century is you start out in the 20th century, European peoples have divided up the world. They basically run the world. They're by far the most powerful, the most economically advanced, the most scientifically advanced. They run the world. And by the end of the 20th century, there is no moral legitimacy for having any sovereignty anywhere. In other words, European peoples have no moral right to sovereignty over any piece of land anywhere, even in Europe, traditional Europe. Because you see, the same people who are promoting massive immigration and so on into this country are promoting immigration to Europe and other areas. And increasingly in Europe, you're getting these ideas that there's no such thing as a nation based on a certain ethnic group that is defending their interests and their territory. Instead, there's a sort of, the idea of a nation is simply a proposition, a certain moral set of values and rights and so on. And that's fundamentally what the Frankfort School is promulgating, especially in the wake of the Frankfort School. People like Lipset and Rad were basically strongly identified Jewish activists. They're associated with the ADL and so on. They are writing and basically saying white Americans have no moral right to have a set of ethnic interests that they are defending.
I first made contact with the idea of political correctness in the early 90s when my son became a student at Harvard University. And during this time, I was not completely unaware of what was going on in academia because I had been a professor at a college here in town. I sort of knew that there were things that were not good to say, that things helped your career, things hurt your career. But this was the first time that I had come across a phrase that actually summarized that whole taboo or that whole sense of speech code, and it was called political correctness. My son's generation were probably more receptive to it than I was, or more sensitive to it than I was, because they were living under this code every day. And so one of the things they did was form an alternative magazine to sort of the reigning hegemony of political ideas on campus. The magazine was called Peninsula, and in those days we still talked about liberals versus conservative. So all the campuses were run by liberals, and so the magazine was going to be conservative in opposition to these liberals. What it was, I think, was more ethnic than that. It was basically Catholics, and oftentimes Irish Catholics, and oftentimes Irish Catholics from Boston, who felt that their values were simply not represented by the ruling class at Harvard. One of the main areas of contention at this time was sexuality, in particular homosexuality. And so the students at Peninsula put out an issue of their magazine about homosexuality, their protest against homosexuality. I don't remember the title, but I remember the cover page had a pink triangle that was sort of smashed into pieces. So here are these guys, they're going to smash the pink triangle. Well, there was a huge, absolute huge reaction to what they did. To give you some indication of what it was like, the Christian minister on campus, a black man by the name of Gomes, holds a rally, and at this rally he comes out and announces that he's a homosexual. I mean, it was a classic instance of the guilty flee where none pursueth. Nobody mentioned him by name, but he's going to announce he's a homosexual. The kids' names were put up on bulletin boards, their phone numbers with instructions to harass them in the middle of the night. He graduated that year when we went for the graduation. It's mentioned in the Harvard Crimson. And then, we're standing in Harvard Yard, and there are all these famous people walking by in the procession. There's John Kenneth Galbraith. There's John Updike. These are just the people I mentioned, and they just go by, and nobody's, doing anything. And suddenly this roar comes up from the crowd, and the roar is getting closer and closer, and you think, who is this? I mean, who is this great man that everyone is recognizing here? Well, it's Reverend Gomes. And his greatness consists in the fact that he was a black man who admitted that he was a homosexual. Okay? Well, I mean, I sort of was attuned to this, so I decided, well, I'll give a talk. That's me. I was doing research on the whole manipulation of race that took place in this country between the time of the Harlem Renaissance in the 20s and the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s. It included people like Jack Kerouac. His book On the Road has this passage where he says he's walking through Denver in twilight, wishing I were a Negro. Why are you wishing you were a Negro? And then there was, of course, Norman Mailer's essay, The White Negro, which was around 1957, the same year that Kerouac's On the Road came out. Now, the interesting thing is that Norman Mailer was scheduled to speak the same night I'm scheduled to speak at Harvard, and because of the publicity I got from the Black Student Association, I got Norman Mailer's room, and he got my room. He got the little room, I got the big room. because I had put up posters, and the title of my talk was, it was Spade Kicks, which I got from Kerouac's novel, Modernity and the Negro as a Paradigm of Sexual Liberation. Well, huge crowd shows up, hostile crowd. About 200 of the students walked out in the middle of the talk and protest, but that still left 300-400 people there. It was a huge number of people. So I was giving the talk, and I was just going through texts that every professor at Harvard could have gotten out of the library. And one of these was Hannah Tillich's memoir. Hannah Tillich was the wife of Paul Tillich. Paul Tillich was the Protestant theologian in the period in America after World War II. You couldn't go into a college bookstore in the 60s without seeing a copy of his book, Courage to Be, which were a series of lectures that he gave. He was named by Time magazine as kind of the official theologian of America. And here I am reading his memoir from his wife's point of view, and it turns out that he was a sexual degenerate. And not only that, but a kind of racially oriented sexual degenerate as well. He loved to go to places like Small's Paradise in Harlem. There's a passage there where Paul was dancing with a negress, and suddenly everybody's booing. And I stop and I said, well, wait a minute, why are you booing? I'm reading a book that you can take out of the library here. It's Hannah Tillich's memoir. I'm not endorsing this, I'm just reading it. And secondly, you endorsed it because Paul Tillich taught at Harvard. So why are you booing me because I'm telling you what the wife of the guy you hired was really like? What's the big deal here? Well, this was not politically correct. But what does politically correct mean in this context? It means you can't read books in the library? It means there's this speech code that prohibits what? Prohibits what? I mean, I thought that's what we as professors were supposed to do. You know, we're supposed to do research like this. Well, anyway, it was clear that there was a deeper grammar to this discussion, and that it wasn't black, and it wasn't homosexual, that these were sort of the puppets that were out there dancing. Maybe the deeper grammar had to do with social engineering. In other words, using race to achieve certain ends. Do you know what I mean? That was getting to the point where you're not allowed to talk about the guy behind the screen. But there was a deeper grammar that needed to be explicated.